Imagine standing in the middle of a lake so vast you cannot see the far shore. Now imagine that same spot thousands of years later as a cracked plain of salt and dust where nothing grows and the wind carries only heat. This isn't a fantasy. It's a real place, and real people watched it happen, not over millions of years, but slowly enough to live through and quickly enough to fear. For most of human history, the deadliest threat our ancestors faced wasn't a predator, a rival tribe, or even disease. It was the sky refusing to give water, drought, the slow, patient disappearance of the one resource no living thing can survive without. And unlike a storm you can shelter from, or a flood you can climb above, drought offers nowhere to hide. It simply arrives, settles in, and waits. So here is the question worth asking. How do you survive when the rain stops and doesn't come back? Not for a week, not for a season, but sometimes for decades at a stretch? When the rivers thin to trickles, the wells go dry, and the animals you depend on wander off to find water you cannot follow them to? When you have no pipelines, no reservoirs engineered by machines, no trucks to haul water across a desert, and no way of knowing whether the next rainy season will save you or finish you? The answer involves buried water older than memory, the deliberate movement of entire peoples across continents, technologies for storing rain that we still use today, and the surprising truth that drought didn't only destroy human societies. Sometimes it forced them to invent the very things that made civilization possible in the first place. Part 1. The real problem with drought. Let's start with what actually kills during a drought, because it isn't only thirst. A person can die of dehydration in a matter of days, yes, but long before that stage arrives, drought works in quieter and more devastating ways. It takes the crops first, then the grazing animals, then the wild game that depended on the same vanishing grass and water. By the time thirst threatens a human being directly, hunger has usually done far more damage across the whole community. This is the cruel arithmetic our ancestors lived inside. Water scarcity is rarely a single problem. It's a cascade. One failed rainy season weakens the herds. A second failed season empties the granaries. A third turns a struggling community into a desperate one. And because early humans had no way to store food across many years, a run of dry seasons could unravel a way of life that had felt permanent and secure only a short time before. So the first thing to understand is that surviving drought was never about enduring thirst for an afternoon. It was about managing a slow-motion emergency that could stretch across an entire generation, where every decision, where to camp, what to plant, when to move, carried consequences that might not reveal themselves for years. Part 2, finding the water that hides the most immediate solution, was also the least obvious, because the water hadn't actually left. It had simply gone underground. Long before anyone understood geology, ancient people learned to read the land for hidden water with astonishing skill. A particular kind of plant growing in an otherwise barren stretch, a subtle dip in the terrain, the behavior of certain animals at dawn, all of these were signs pointing to water sitting just beneath the surface. Communities that could read those signs survived. Those that couldn't often didn't. In the deserts of the ancient Near East and North Africa, people eventually went further and engineered access to buried water directly. They dug deep wells by hand, and in some regions developed gently sloping underground tunnels that carried water for miles from distant highlands to dry settlements. using nothing but gravity and generations of careful engineering. These systems tapped aquifers, vast natural stores of water held inside layers of porous rock, filled slowly over thousands of years during wetter times. That detail matters more than it first appears. An aquifer acts like a savings account for water. During good years, rain seeps down and fills it. During dry years, that stored water can be drawn back up. A community sitting above a large aquifer had a buffer against drought that its neighbors simply did not, entirely independent of how clever or hardworking either group happened to be. Geography quietly was deciding who lived and who moved on. Part 3. Storing the rain when it came. If you can't rely on rain to fall when you need it, the next best thing is to catch it when it does and hold on to it. And ancient humans became remarkably good at exactly this. Across the dry regions of the world, people built cisterns, sealed underground chambers designed to collect rainwater from a single heavy storm and preserve it for months afterward. They carved channels into hillsides to funnel runoff toward these tanks, lined them with clay or plaster to stop the water from seeping away, and covered them to slow evaporation under the punishing sun. A single well-built cistern could carry a household through an entire dry season on the strength of just a few days of rain. On a larger scale, whole communities constructed terraces and low stone walls across sloping ground. When the rare rains arrived, these walls slowed the water down, stopped it from rushing away and stripping the soil bare, and coaxed it to soak into the ground where crops could reach it. This wasn't decorative landscaping. It was survival engineering, refined over generations of watching what worked and what washed away. What's striking is how independently this same idea appeared. Peoples on different continents, with no contact between them, arrived at the same fundamental insight. Don't fight the scarcity of water, capture its abundance whenever it briefly arrives, and stretch that abundance across the long, dry emptiness that always follows. Part 4. When the Green World Died. Now the story shifts from clever survival tactics to something far larger. Entire landscapes that transform beneath the feet of the people living on them. Return to that image from the very beginning, a green Sahara. For thousands of years, much of what is now the world's largest hot desert was grassland and lake, fed by monsoon rains that pushed far to the north. People settled there in large numbers, herded cattle, fished the lakes, and left behind rock art showing a lush world teeming with animals that could not survive there for a single day now. But that world ended. As the rains gradually retreated southward, the lakes shrank, the grass thinned, and the great green expanse began its slow turn back to desert. Crucially, this ending wasn't smooth. The climate flickered. Decades of drought broken by sudden wet spells that must have felt like salvation before the dryness returned yet again. Communities lived through wild swings between hope and disaster, sometimes within a single lifetime, never knowing whether the rain was gone for good or merely pausing. And when it finally became clear the water would not return, the people did the one thing that had kept our species alive through every crisis before it. They moved. They followed the water as it withdrew, carrying with them everything they had learned about survival, seeding new communities in the river valleys and grasslands where the rain still fell. Migration wasn't failure. It was in many ways the oldest and most reliable survival strategy of all. Part 5. Drought as the Mother of Invention. Here is the part that overturns our instincts most completely. We tend to assume drought only destroys, but repeatedly across the ancient world, the pressure of vanishing water forced human societies to invent their way into entirely new futures. Consider what happens when abundance disappears. When wild food is plentiful, there's little reason to labor over planting, storing, or building permanent settlements. Nature simply provides. But when the rains grow unreliable and the wild food thins out, that easy life becomes impossible. And it was often exactly at these moments of pressure that people turned to farming in earnest, to storing grain against future scarcity, to digging irrigation channels, and to organizing themselves into the larger, more coordinated communities that agriculture demands. In several great river valleys, the response to an increasingly dry surrounding landscape was to concentrate along the one dependable water source that remained. People gathered by the rivers learned to manage their flow and built some of the earliest cities the world had ever seen. Dense, organized, sophisticated settlements born not from comfort but from constraint. The desert closing in around them left them no other choice, and in answering that pressure, they laid the foundations of organized civilization itself. So the same force that emptied the grasslands and drove people from their homes also, in the right circumstances, pushed them toward invention, cooperation, and permanence. Scarcity was a brutal teacher, but it was a teacher. Part 6. The Long Memory of Survival. There's one more thread that ties all of this together, and it's the quietest, but perhaps the most important. Knowledge, passed carefully from one generation to the next. None of what we've described, reading the land for hidden water, building a cistern that won't leak, knowing which season to plant and which direction to migrate when the rains fail, none of it was rediscovered from scratch each time a drought arrived. It was remembered, taught around fires, demonstrated by hand, encoded into stories and songs and ritual, so that the hard-won lessons of one generation's suffering became the ordinary wisdom of the next. This is, in a sense, humanity's true survival technology. Not any single well or wall or seed, but the ability to accumulate experience across time and hand it forward intact. A community facing its first drought was terribly vulnerable. A community facing its 10th, armed with the memory of the previous 9, was something else entirely. Prepared, adaptable, and far harder to destroy. That long memory is why our ancestors could inhabit places that should have been impossible. They weren't simply enduring the dry world. They were carrying thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to outlast it. So how did ancient humans survive endless drought when the rain refused to fall and the green world turned to dust around them? Not by passively waiting for the sky to change its mind. They survived by finding the water that hid beneath the ground, by catching and storing the rain in the brief moments it fell, by reading the land with a skill we've largely forgotten, and by moving, following the water across continents rather than clinging to places it had abandoned. And when scarcity pressed hardest, they didn't only endure it, they answered it, inventing agriculture, engineering, and eventually cities, turning the very crisis that should have destroyed them into the foundation of everything that came after. The Sahara was once green, and then it was not. And the people who lived through that transformation carried its lessons outward across the world. They left behind wells still tapped today, walls still standing, art still marking the memory of a wetter age, and above all, a legacy of adaptation written into the way we still store water, farm dry land, and prepare for the years the rain forgets to come. Drought was never only an ending. Often enough, in enough places, it was the pressure that shaped who we became. Proof that human beings have always been at our most inventive, not when the world is generous, but precisely when it is not.